It was said, among men, Lu Bu, among horses, red hair.
But who was this Lu Bu, and what weapon did he use?
Hey, what's up? This is Sifu Kuttel, and welcome to the first episode in a series called Han Dynasty Weapons. But first, let's talk about Lu Bu the man and his horse, the red hare. The man was a strong and fierce fighter, and the horse was of a fast and powerful breed. The duo gained fame both on and off the battlefield, and although we know them from the novel, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, or through Chinese opera, or through video games like Dynasty Warriors or Total War, a lot of these stories actually hold some truth. The flying general Lu Bu was the strongest warrior of his time. And I know that may seem like fighting words because this is comparing him to the god of war himself, Guan Yu, but there's record of him taking on Guan Yu, Liu Bei, and Zhang Fei at the same time by himself and ending in stalemate. Besides being famous for his battlefield skills, Lu Bu was also famous for betraying his lords and adopted fathers. First being Ding Yuan, and who he betrayed to join Dong Zhuo, who gave him a generalship and lots of social status, and later adopted him as his own son, who he also ended up betraying and killing to further go on and serve other lords and betray them as well and join other sides. He had a history of just going out for himself and seeking his own status by joining different warlords and then eventually betraying them to join another more powerful warlord. And this went on pretty much until his end. Now let's talk about the weapons of Lu Bu. In the historical records, it is said that he was skilled in pretty much every weapon, but his skills in archery shadowed them all. He was even known to intervene and prevent a battle by making a bet with the two opposing generals that if he could shoot an arrow and hit the forward blade on a halberd from 500 yards away, they'd have to pack it up and go home. His skills took flight as the arrow hit dead on, causing both armies to cheer his praise. However, most of the time in the novel, he's described as carrying around his halberd, which is not that, or that, or that, or even that. You see, halberds of the Han Dynasty looked like this. This is a Ji. Now you might be ready to comment and say, no, that's a Ge. And in fact, it's not. This is an evolution of the Ge. So let's take a look at the Ge and we can see how it evolved to become this, the Ji. The Ge is a dagger axe, which originated from the Bronze Age. And basically, what you have is a dagger-style blade that's attached to a pole that sticks out and used like an axe. It did not have this forward spear blade. Now, the Ge was really effective on the battlefield because it could be used for pecking, slicing, or hooking and slashing. And oftentimes you would see an evolution where they would have one or 3 or 5 blades descending down the shaft of the pole, so it could be a much more devastating weapon. It was commonly used for chariot warfare, where it was attached to a very long pole so that one chariot could attack the charioteer of another chariot by swinging over the top and then pecking and slashing downwards. Now, one of the next evolutions of the Ge was that they actually started putting a spear tip at the end of the pole. So you would still have your dagger axe and then the tip of a spear that was common use in the regular infantry. That is where it crossed over and became a Ji, but it really didn't hit this level of engineering until the Han Dynasty, where they had a better understanding of metalworking and iron forging, and they could actually make a single piece that could have both the spear end and the dagger axe end. Now, really what's one of the defining features of the construction of the Ji is that there is a slot in the wood so that you can actually pass the blade through. Then you can tie the blade on and it allows for a lot more pressure to be used this way and this way. So now you can press and pull and shear with the blade and you don't have to worry about it getting hit sideways and breaking the shaft of the weapon or just falling off. Now, on top of that, there's cast metal that also has a slot to reinforce the tip of the wooden shaft. So you have a lot more stability and structure there to keep this blade in place. Now, ji are extremely versatile, and they had many different configurations as you could change the length of the shaft, going from the super long-range chariot warfare pole with an extremely long pole and a smaller ji because it gets a little bit heavy, to the halberd style like you see here, to a short pole ji, and then even configurations where you just hold the blade itself in your hand and even as a throwing weapon. It was a very, very popular weapon, and it could be used in many different ways, and in that they actually had many different sizes of ji blades. But we'll explore those in later videos. For now, I want to talk about the long pole or the halberd style ji, like what Lu Bu would have used. Now, can we say for certain this is exactly what Lu Bu used? No, we can't. There is some speculation that he used just a spear and his bow, or he used a halberd such as this, the ji halberd, or he used just a sword. So there's really no definite record of what he used, although we can speculate because he was on horseback, he probably had a pole arm, and the popularity of the halberd itself, and just the halberd being a status symbol, this leads us to think that that's probably what he had. Now, why do we see a crescent blade ji halberd as we see in Chinese opera or in movies or even in the classic drawings from the Romance of the Three Kingdoms? Well, again, this came from the Song Dynasty, and this is the style of halberd that was existing in the Song Dynasty. So once you start having illustrations that are mass-produced, once you have these halberds that people usually see and you start doing performances with it, that's what's going to stick. And so nowadays, when we look back at the past, we only see as far as those illustrations go. And really, it's been more of a modern thing that we've been finding the connection of the ji halberd. It's not that this hasn't existed and we haven't unearthed blades like this. It's just that up until this point, archaeologists were a little unsure of how the ji was set up. They had the blade intact and they had the brass fittings, but because they didn't have the pole and because this has an unusual shape, you can see it's actually a 5-point shape that's on here. They weren't really sure how the weapon was put together. So you have just kind of a divergence of going into the cultural side of stories and Chinese opera and the archaeological side, which is still unsure of exact, and they're not going to make any definite claims until now they're starting to be able to piece it together of how these were actually configured. A lot of records that come from the Han Dynasty are from wall rubbings, from stone engravings that are inside of tombs, because it's been over 2,000 years. A lot of these materials don't last that they could keep records on. And this is also why we don't see a lot of treaties or records of how these weapons were used. So it's up to basically what we've learned from later dynasties' records and going into the Ming Dynasty that kept really good records of how their military weapons were used, and then martial arts like in the Qing Dynasty. So my experience of using a weapon like this comes from using the hook spear. So I took that approach from how we use the hook spear in Choi Li Fut, but that's a Qing Dynasty martial art that's only 200 years old. So we have 10 times that amount of time passing in between where this was used on the battlefield and where Choi Li Fut was using it in the forms. Does that mean that the modern is incorrect, or does it mean that it's more optimized? No, I would say it's just a different approach to it. The style of Choi Li Fut gives you a little bit more room to move with these weapons, whereas probably on the battlefield, the techniques were a little more straightforward and more compact, so you're not going to find as much swinging as you would in a Choi Li Fut form. But when it comes down to it, you have a very specific shaped weapon that has very specific attributes that you're going to use a very specific way. So they will share similar techniques. It's just how it's trained, how it's displayed, and what type of tactics you use that are going to be the big difference. Now this G blade is made by LK Chen. LK Chen is always about making historically accurate weapons from Chinese history, and that's where we're getting a lot of these Han Dynasty reproductions at very high quality. Now it is sharp, so the blade is sharpened here towards this tip, it's sharpened on this edge, and then all the way down to the base here. The only part that's not sharp is along the spine where it touches the shaft of the pole. There is also an area which you can see here. This area is not sharp where it passes through the shaft. That area is obviously not sharp. There's no reason to sharpen it, but it is sharp on all sides. So it's it's a pretty nasty weapon in that respect. It can do a lot. Now you can see here the weapon is pattern welded. The blade is pattern weld, and that's to reflect the type of forging that was done at the time. They don't do the exact same forging practices because it's not as efficient as what they can do now. So you do have a little bit more modern practices of forging, but they want to try to match the blade as closely as they could to the actual historical blades. Now there's, like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of different sizes of G blades that were used and found and unearthed in archaeological digs. So LK Chen has two available on their website. They have this is the larger blade G, and then they have a smaller blade G that was typically used for polearms, especially like on the chariot, when you have a really long pole. Because even though this blade is light when you hold it in the hand, once you put it on a longer pole, you get a lot more weight at the end, and you get that leverage really kicks in, and that weight distribution is really going to make a difference. So it is suggested for like the pole arms to have the smaller blade, and then when you get into like a shorter pole like that, or just a hand G, that you use this style of blade. Now for me, I've found no problems using the larger blade at the end of a pole arm. I can feel the weight in movement, and it just carries itself through it. So there's the momentum does pay off in the application, whether you're spearing and thrusting or you're using the pecking or piercing techniques with the side blade. Now I'll leave all the specs down below, as well as a link to their site so you can read more about the G and you can get one for yourself. But I think it's a really fascinating weapon. You've already seen in my previous video how to tie this, but I've been really amazed in how this weapon works. Now let's look at the main attributes for attack. We have the spearing and thrusting blade, as well as the forward blade that is for piercing and pecking. And this is really where the weapon shines, because you can easily stand side by side and then drive the spear forward and in with good range, good reach. And then the forward blade, like the dagger axe, has the ability to get that extra momentum for more piercing power. What else is really nice about this is, even though it's not much, this can go around corners. So if something does get blocked and they're not having enough, if they don't have enough structure to press out or enough energy to match yours, you can still end up getting through to get your technique. The thing though that really stands out to me as far as attack goes though, is that we have a good blade edge here. And I was really surprised on this one. It has an excellent cutting ability with this, with the spear blade. You get a lot of leverage with the staff and with this extra reach that's not common that you see with like the regular spear heads. This can really slice through. Now, in using the blade edge here for shearing, it is very effective as long as you have some kind of resistance. So for me, I started with cutting water bottles. I wanted to see how this would do. And spearing and pecking worked phenomenal. However, shearing by pulling the blade edge back was not as successful. And what I realized from this is a couple of things. One is blade edge alignment is key whenever you're going to try to cut through. You don't have a lot of particular range to develop a lot of momentum to slice through. So unless your blade is super sharp, you have to have a lot of skill in doing this. And when we're pulling back, it's not as easy to bring your arms back without having some kind of an effect of the spear shaft or the G shaft changing angle. So oftentimes I would bounce the water bottle away. However, once there's some resistance to hold the object in place, this thing cuts right through. It'll shear through, no problem. So you do have that as kind of a secondary attack, either pressing forward with this blade, shearing forward, or pulling back to shear. But I would also say that there is benefit to the blade edge being used as a slash in this manner. Now, having accuracy with this forward blade is not the easiest, and I found this when working with the water bottle. Sure, I could easily peck and poke right into the water bottle from a stationary position, but once I started from a moving position, I would oftentimes hit below or sometimes above the blade. So I wouldn't necessarily say that your peck is going to be something where you're going to pinpoint anything, and that's where you can have your shearing or your pulling and slashing as a backup. But when you do have a larger object, like striking towards somebody's torso, you're going to find that this has absolutely no problem. And even at a close range, I found that you can generate quite a bit of power because of this leverage that you can pierce right into things. I put a t-shirt over a cardboard box just because I wanted to see if that extra amount of resistance of the t-shirt would do anything to the blade if it wasn't just right, but honestly, it felt like there was nothing there. It felt like I was just poking straight into the cardboard box with this one, and it's just brutal. Now, there was an old saying that goes something along the lines of, if you try to catch a G, you're going to lose your fingers. Meaning that once this got behind you and they started pulling back, bye-bye fingers. And that actually, I can understand that, because once you have something that isn't going to move or isn't going to be too light, like when you're pulling this back, if somebody's holding on to it, or if you get it behind somebody's neck and start pulling, you're going to have some resistance. They're not just going to bounce and repel away. And that's where it's really going to have that shearing power. And I simulated this by sticking 2 carrots in the top of that cardboard box. If it can cut through carrots that easy, it's going to be able to cut through fingers with power. So this is quite, like I said, a brutal weapon. Now let's look at some attacking techniques with the G. What I find really interesting about this weapon is that you can look at the exact same mechanic and have 2 different techniques depending on which blade you're focusing on. So we'll approach these as similar mechanics of movement, and we will highlight how you can use it with the spear blade or with the dagger axe blade. Now, typically when you're holding a pole arm, you want to have as much reach as possible. You want to have as much room to hit your opponent and keeping yourself safe. And typically we would use this one in a single end style grip. So my right hand is palm up, my left hand is palm down, and my left hand has some flexibility and movement, but my right hand is going to do most of the control and angling of the weapon. With that said, you can also use this weapon with a double end style grip. And the reason that you would want to use this one is for more leverage power, and especially in lower strikes. So we have a lot more leverage, a lot more power when we're attacking low towards the legs here. But it doesn't have the same thrusting ability as we would have with a single end grip. With that said, I also want to mention I don't have a lot of space here to get out of frame, so I'm not going to hold it all the way back. So you'll have to work with me on that one. Now let's start by our forward thrusting technique. This is going to be probably your most common because on the battlefield, you're side by side with other people, other warriors, that you're working with. So you're not going to have a lot of room to swing around, and it's going to be a lot more forward piercing pokes. So what we want to do here is make sure that we keep a nice straight line from the point of origin to going and hitting our target. So try not to twist, try not to turn, try not to make a curvy path as we're doing this. We can do a straight line poke this way, we can do more of an upward poke, or we can even poke down towards the legs. But again, both hands are working on the thrust, and we want to make sure that we hit our target itself. This one's pretty straightforward. we're going to just pierce right into our opponent. Now, when we look at the dagger axe blade or the forward blade, we have an option to either press or shear with this. So I wouldn't think of necessarily always cutting through. If you're lucky and you hit a soft area, you have a chance that you can shear all the way through. But most likely what's going to happen is once you make contact, it's going to slip past and you're going to end up slashing your target. And again, we can slash up high, we can slash towards the middle, we can slash down low, or you can just jam it in and try to shear, which maybe you can get a clean cut all the way through, but most likely you're just going to break the surface of whatever it is. You're going to break that open with it. Now we can look at something that's more of an attack that would be used with the dagger axe side, and this is going to be a pecking technique. So we can do a downward diagonal peck with this one. So we're trying to lead in with the tip of that forward blade. We're trying to peck inward towards our opponent, cutting towards that shoulder here. So as we come down this way, we're making contact. This gets a lot of leverage because we have the guidance and the push with our front hand, but we also have the pull from our backhand. So we get this counter leverage to really get a lot of power here. The thing that I love about this technique is you have two backups to it. If for some reason you miss your target and you overshoot or your target moves, you can now use pulling and shearing from there, or slashing again as we do this. Or if your opponent or your target moves back away from you, or you just don't get as much reach as you thought, you now have a cutting edge with your spear blade. So this is just similar to taking a sword and cutting through, and I found this one to be very effective. Again, this leverage does so much for the weapon. It slices through with ease. Now, since I've been working with the G, I've worked in a couple of different configurations, and one of the things that's really impressed me is the defensive side of this. And this is not just for blocking with the shaft or trying to swat with the sides, or even using this to hook. I mean, that's an obvious given, and that was a common battlefield tactic, was you would hook the opponent's weapons. But I found that actually this area is very, very important in defense, because you can use it to catch and stifle and hinder your opponent's advance. And it provides a lot more protection than you would expect. So in looking at like the hook spear form, there's a part where you're going to turn and move this from side to side. Originally, I figured this was just strike, strike, strike. But it doesn't give you enough time to really dig in and use a lot of power. Now, yes, you can use it as a strike, turn, strike, but it doesn't give you that same amount of power as when you get actual leverage behind it and really turn it around to try to hit. So it doesn't feel as strong in that aspect. However, in the idea of catching a weapon or pressing to this side, pressing to the other side, and advancing through and catching the opponent's weapon to jam them up, push it back towards them, and open them up for attack, it makes perfect sense. And in sparring, which I've made wooden G, I found this area is extremely useful in catching an opponent's weapon. And again, we'll get into this later, especially when we're talking about the hand G, but I have to say, this is one of the standout techniques that I've seen with this weapon, and it's just using this area right here as a place of manipulation and control, or catching the opponent's weapon in a defensive manner. Now on the defensive side, not only is hooking nice, but this forward press with this corner is extremely, extremely effective. So you just have to get used to turning your hand around as you do this. And this comes from your right hand or your forward hand turning the weapon itself, and your backhand staying loose and just gripping at the last second so that you have some structure behind it. So a good way to practice this is just turn it from side to side. Now in catching, it doesn't have to be completely flat. It looks better if you want to have that nice kung fu form look to it, but in all reality, you can probably catch it even if it has a slight downward angle as compared to being flat. But here, I'm going to keep the weapon itself at a slight upward angle so that if I come up underneath a sword or their arm, or just come up to press them, the opponent themselves, I can catch and press outward here once I make contact. So I go to this corner or I go to that corner as well. And of course, this can be used low as well to push the opponent backward, but most of the times this is going to be defensive to block a high strike. As it comes lower, you'll use more of the shaft or in between the hands if your opponent gets close. But here is really the highlight of this weapon. Now, of course, you do have to remember that everything that I'm talking about is from an infantry style perspective. This is somebody on the ground using this weapon. Polearms, like the halberd, were commonly used on horseback. So that changes the technique completely. I don't know how to ride horses. I haven't ridden horseback since I was a child, and definitely not with a weapon. You have to have a well-trained horse to be able to handle that, and you have to know what you're doing with the weapon as well. However, LK has videos of himself out riding horseback with the halberd, so you can see kind of how this weapon was modified to be used on horseback. It really changes it a lot, so it is important to keep that in mind, that this was both a cavalry and an infantry style weapon. Now let's put this all together into a single technique. So we're going to utilize that defensive block. We're going to block outward. So I'm going to start with the weapon in front of me, and then I'm going to reach outward towards my front hand. So if it's with my right hand, I go out towards the right to block my opponent. From here, I'm going to turn the blade inward and peck inward with this. So I want to use that forward blade to go right into my opponent. Or I can use this to get behind them and pull backwards and rip with the blade. And then we go in for our final thrust. Okay, so again, we have 1, 2, 3, 4. Now you can work with different types of footwork on this. So what I would also suggest is block, advancing step forward, peck horizontal, step and shear as you pull back using your body weight as well, and then following up with that final thrust as we shift forward. So again, we have 1 step, 2 pull back, 3, 4. And it's a really nice way of getting used to some of the highlight techniques that we can use with this weapon. Of course, we can change the configuration of the hands. We can attack high, we can attack low. There's lots of different ways that we can use this, but here's a start for you. So there you have it, the real weapon of the flying general Lu Bu. So let me know what you guys think about this. This is a really fascinating weapon, and I've spent a few months just working with it in different ways, on the long pole, on the short pole, as hand Ji, and it's been a wonderful weapon to explore, and we've really only scratched the surface. So I'd love to hear your ideas on this, and especially if you guys own this and if you guys have done any testing with it, what you guys have learned from your own tests. Now, this is the first episode in our Han Dynasty weapons series, and it may change a little bit as we get through, but I really think this is going to be a cool series because we can look at the historical weapons and their cultural counterparts as we kind of move up through the dynasties, and the weapons that we currently use today in traditional Chinese martial arts, which typically just come from the Ming and Qing dynasties. So, hope you guys enjoy this one. Again, all the information for LK Chen, this blade, their website, that page, it's all going to be down in the description below, so be sure to check that out, and I'll see you guys in the next episode. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.
Bye.